Sweeney on the Poet Next Door exhibit that's downstairs in our booth gallery. On behalf of our Executive Director, Bill Wallace, our Board of Trustees, and all the staff here, we welcome you. We're always excited to see new faces, old faces, sometimes new faces on the old faces. That's fine too. So we're happy you're here tonight to celebrate Stanley Kunitz, whose birthday is on Tuesday. So this is very timely. I'm going to turn it over to Beth Sweeney, our moderator. I just trying to let you a couple of housekeeping things. Restrooms are right here on the top floor. Look for the giant yellow smiley face and you're in the right spot. And we are excited you're here. Please enjoy some refreshments. The galleries are open till 8 p.m. and let's have another great program. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm Beth, and many of you I know. If I don't know you, please come up and say hello to me later. Can you hear me? Yeah. Is that better? Yeah, it sounds like that's better. So this event is part of a special birthday celebration for Stanley Kunitz this year. As Vanessa already said, his 120th birthday is next Tuesday. And next Thursday, we're having our annual Kunitz Medal ceremony. We actually have a Kunitz medalist here on the stage, the kind of very low stage with us tonight. And next Thursday, Victor Infante will be named. I'm not sure how
the 11th.
The 11th recipient of the Stanley Kunitz Medal, which is awarded. I'll say very, very simply. There's a longer description, but it's awarded to a poet who's associated with Worcester County, who has dedicated his or her life to poetry and to nurturing poetry. So I hope that you can come back next Thursday for a different event. And that event will be from 6:30 to 8:30. The exhibit will be open at 6. So what we're hoping to do tonight is to have a conversation. So I have some ground rules as well. One ground rule that I already warned Jim and Judy of is that I don't know if anybody's read The Lord of the Flies. And we're not going to do like a kind of Hunger Games thing here, but if you've ever read The Lord of the Flies, you remember there's a conch shell, and you can't speak unless you have the conch shell. So we have this wireless mic that we'll be passing back and forth. And we have a series of questions in mind. I'll be asking the questions, and I'll be starting off with some questions for both Judy and Jim. Basically, like, why would you want to do research on Stanley Kunitz? And what would be the advantages and pitfalls of doing so? And then I'll ask each of them some more specific questions about their research, and then we'll sort of move towards like takeaways, like what have they learned, what can you guys learn, and then there should be time for questions and answers, questions from the audience and answers. We're a small group, so please think of this as a sort of like really an informal conversation when we get to the Q&A, or at any time, like if suddenly you're aware that there's food at the back of the room and that you didn't take any yet, please get up and get some. So I'm going to introduce first James Dempsey, who is a journalist, a poet, a novelist, and a biographer. His books include The Tortured Life of Schofield Thayer, a study of the Worcester native, who is coincidentally the nephew of Ernest Thayer, who wrote Casey at the Bat. And Schofield Thayer became an important poet, publisher, and editor of The Dial, a literary magazine that had actually been around for a while, but that under his editorship and with his help, I guess, published the work of leading modernist poets, including Stanley Kunitz. And if you look on the display on the back table, there's an issue of the Worcester Review from, I think, maybe 2015 or 2016 that Jim edited. 2016. He edited this feature section on Schofield Thayer, and you can see some of the very first poems that Kunitz published in the Dial, in that reprinted there. And he is now working on a biography of Stanley Kunitz. And I think that this may possibly be one of the first times in which he has publicly appeared as someone who's working on a biography of Stanley Kunitz. Judith Ferrara is a painter, a poet, and a scholar who, as I already mentioned, received the Stanley Kunitz Medal. Her research on Kunitz's life and work began when she directed the docent program at the Stanley Kunitz Boyhood Home at 4 Woodford Street here in Worcester, and trained docents to lead people on tours. She then authored a series of scholarly essays on Kunitz. And Judy recently published A Feast of Losses. Actually, there's no A. Is there? Feast of Losses.
It is an A. Yes.
It is.
A.
Okay, I was correct.
Yes.
A Feast of Losses, Yetta, Dine, and her son, the poet Stanley Kunitz. And there are bookmarks on your seats. We're having kind of a competition, Judy and me, a friendly competition. Whose bookmark is larger? They're both oversized, really, I think. So there's a bookmark for Judy's book, and then there's another bookmark which lists events that go along with the exhibit. And Judy also has copies of the book, which she can sell, will sell afterwards if you would like to buy one. And Judy's book is now, I don't think I've ever been able to say this about anyone. Her book it's going to be an audiobook. And I don't know, maybe it almost seems like having an audiobook is even more impressive than having a print book. I don't know.
I don't know.
Okay, so I'm now going to start with my first question, and I think I will ask Jim first, and then he can, after he answers, he can pass the mic to Judy. And the question is, well, all right, I'm not going to look at you. I'm going to look at my interlocutors here. Jim, could you say something about your project on Stanley Kunitz, including like what led you to do such a thing or to begin to do such a thing?
Thank you. I guess I've been sort of looking around for a project ever since I finished the Thayer book. That was 2014. Kunitz was always kind of dancing around on the outskirts of my mind. I always loved his poetry. I thought his life was most interesting. And I looked into it a bit further, and I found out that there wasn't a biography. I think I could probably get into a fight over this, but I think the 4 important poets from Worcester in the last century are Elizabeth Bishop, Frank O'Hara, Charles Olson, and Kunitz. And Kunitz is the only one who doesn't have a biography. So I thought, well, that sounds like a job for me.
And can I ask a very quick follow-up question? Why did you list the poets in that order?
Because the first letters of the last names make the word book.
Okay. Judy, what is your book about, and what led you to write such a book?
Well, and by the way, I read a Telegram article when you were being interviewed about the Thayer book, and the last sentence in that article was, well, the question was, what are you going to do next? And you said, the last line of that interview is, write a biography of Stanley Kunitz.
I did?
Yes, you did. Aha. I sat right up. Yes. My project is a hybrid biography, memoir, diary of Yetta, Jaspin, Kunitz, Dine. And I couldn't get involved in that without bringing in her son to the mix, because he was so central to her life and who would buy a book about Yetta, Jaspin, Kunitz, Dine, without hearing about something about Stanley. So that's what my project is, and it's been a 14-year go, as Beth pointed out, and it started with the docent program, and in order to teach the docents how to give house tours at 4 Woodford Street, the boyhood home of Stanley Kunitz, I needed to develop some research. So that started after, Greg Stockmall passed away suddenly in 2008, December, and Carol asked all of us in the Worcester County Poetry Association to come together and talk about, she wanted the house tours that Greg used to give to continue. So I volunteered to do this task. So my research started in 2009, and it was really focused on Stanley Kunitz. And Yetta was just his mother. I mean, I knew very little about her because he was the obvious focus of this, because I loved his poetry, well, certainly since The Testing Tree in 1971 when it came out. And my husband and I heard him in many readings in Provincetown and Wellfleet and here in Worcester. So I was a fan for sure. So I was very privileged to be training docents to give these house tours. So that's this, and the articles that Beth was referring to appeared in the Worcester Review in the first one, and here's Chris Gilbert on the cover of the 2012 essay, and the other one is the one that you guest edited. So I had to contact Stanley's daughter, Gretchen, out in California, and she was so generous in giving me permission to publish the different works and so on. So I taught 2 classes at Assumption in the senior program, WISE, Worcester Initiative for Senior Education, and there was such a reaction to Yetta that I thought, well, what we knew about her through Stanley's voice and eyes and so on, and the interviews and the poems certainly, there had to be more. So I contacted Gretchen and asked her if she had the memoir that is featured for 9 pages in this book, Next to Last Things. And she said, as a matter of fact, I do, and it's in the attic, and I'll get it and send it to you. And she sent it to me with a whole bunch of other documents. So that was the beginning of this, and I went over by 4 minutes.
That's okay.
There we go.
So my next question is in a way, it's for me the most interesting question, which is what are the challenges of writing a biography of Stanley Kunitz? And of course, I imagine the challenges of writing a biography of anyone are immense. I mean, I imagine partly if you're a biographer, you just know you're going to get it wrong because you're writing about someone else. But how about Kunitz in particular? What are the particular challenges that make doing biographical research into Stanley Kunitz's life not for the faint of heart?
Well, he lived a long time. He was 100 years plus. The working title I had for the biography was Poet of a Century. And the fact that he lived through the entire century, 1905 to 2006, he even without the poetry aspect of it, he was a witness to many things, many changes going on in the world, from the fall of empires to the rise and fall of schools of poetry. And he was deeply involved in all of it. In particular, what's difficult with working with Stanley is that he played fast and loose with the truth on many occasions. We can go into that a bit more when we talk about the research. But I think it's true for all of us that we create a story that explains who we are. And that story might not be exactly what other people see as ourselves. And I think that's particularly true of Kunitz. He actually said the most important thing the first thing a poet should do is create the person who writes the poems. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of what he did throughout his life, constantly creating, recreating the person that he wanted to be. It wasn't always the person he actually was, and that makes it difficult.
Well, the most rewarding part of reading and doing research about Stanley and Yetta was the amount of material. It was never, gee, I can't find anything on this or that. There's so much. The Princeton collection, his papers, 115 linear feet. That was just what he sold to Princeton. There was, of course, he didn't give everything to them, and that's where it became interesting with Yetta, in that he held back her diary and her memoir and her letters. There are 4 letters that were never seen. And he did that because I believe, and it's evident, that he was building a legend about her for all of us. And she stepped in because of what happened with those students at Assumption who said, how could she treat her son like this? Why wasn't she more affectionate? And why did she slap him? And all of the things that are apparent in the poems and the interviews. So that's what made it rewarding, was she stepped in because of Gretchen giving me access to the documents, and I photocopied every single document. That's what this is, and I welcome anyone who wants to take a look later. And then I transcribed everything. So this is, and I did not, she was a terrible speller. And I had to really try to figure out what in the world she was spelling. But her writing was so entrancing. That's the reward of Yetta. What a writer. What a writer. Because if you've read the book, I did not change a word of hers. I spelled it right and I put some punctuation in, but I did not change a word. And if you're excited by what she's saying in any way whatsoever, it's her. And that's the greatest reward.
I'm just thinking of the contrast between the scrupulously faithful and exact biographer and the subject who plays fast and loose with the truth. And one thing we were talking about the other day is that in one of his poems, Kunitz says that his birth certificate burned up in a fire at Worcester City Hall, but there was no such fire. And when I was working on a tour of Stanley Kunitz's childhood haunts, especially around Kelly Square and Green Street and going up Vernon Hill, I found, when I talked to Judy about this, there were references to all of his school records also having been burnt up. And I think there was sort of like an insurance form he was filling out or something like that. Judy will remember, I know, and maybe Jim will as well, that he said he couldn't supply his school records because they had all burned up. And so I'd mentioned this to Jim the other day and kind of thinking of it in terms of how Kunitz seems to have in his mind this kind of like a kind of imagined sense of his life in Worcester having no documentary proof that keeps coming up in these different settings. And I think Jim said, yes, and it also suggests a certain hostility towards the city, that maybe, like he's like imagining these things being burnt down. So I'm now going to ask a question that for me is also a really important question, and I think Jim has already touched on it a little bit, but I feel like when you write a biography, or when you read a biography, either one, you're reading a story of someone's life, and it kind of gets back to the same kind of issue that you expect it to be factual and accurate, and everything should be documented, but at the same time it should be a story. It has to have some kind of narrative shape, and one of the things that you're doing is you're taking someone else's life and you're making a kind of story out of it, where it seems to be leading somewhere. There's a kind of pattern. It has sort of an arc, we would say now. And so my question now for both of you, and it's a harder question for Jim because he's just at the beginning of working on his biography, but like what kind of story are you telling? What's the arc? Because I feel like almost I'm just kind of imagining that when you're faced with a task like this, even in your own mind, you have to have a kind of story to give it a kind of shape when you kind of think about what it is you're trying to do. And let's start with Judy this turn.
Well, when I was doing my dissertation, one of the things for all those of you who have gone through that process is there's an abstract, and you have to have that right. It's the forefront of the work, and I found that when I was doing that, I kept going back to that every time I started to write, and I found that very useful with this project. In the prologue, I would read the prologue and make revisions, because even though I was in the middle of the book, it helped me stay, in a sense, on track, but also rethink some of the things I had said in the prologue and be able to reshape things. So I absolutely recommend that to anybody who's on a big project. But I would just like to read the answer to your question, Beth. It's like, what do you expect? What is it that you're doing here? This is from the prologue. Despite its mid-20th century origin, Yetta's observations provoke readers to think about economic and religious oppression and the challenges of immigrant life, subjects that reach across the decades to touch us today. Taken as a whole, this book challenges the reader because it presents three situations. First, a precise and relevant rendering of one woman's struggles. Second, a mother-son relationship complicated by his representation of her in poems and interviews. Third, one person's prescient arguments for death with dignity. And that's...
Very good.
Yeah. What I hope you get out of it.
So
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
what story?
Oh, the story.
Well,
Yeah.
So what story do you hope or expect or imagine at this point that your biography
you
will tell?
you don't really hope and you don't expect. You do imagine, because you have to kind of keep your mind open as to what you're going to discover as you go through the material. But you've got to stay on your toes all the time too, because things change, and you have to be ready for that change when they come along. Especially with somebody like Stanley, who will massage the truth. And there are times when he does that, say in his poems. I'm thinking about the poem 3 Floors, where he talks about sleeping on the 2nd floor of the house. Judy discovered that he didn't sleep on the 2nd floor, he slept on the 1st floor of the house. But for the sake of the poem, it worked. So there's kind of an aesthetic argument for that kind of alteration of the truth. But it can get a bit darker, and certainly the notion of imaginatively burning down buildings for a biographical convenience, which is what he did on those occasions, is a little something altogether different. And then one of the threads of the Kunitz legend is that he had this stellar career at Harvard, that he was rebuffed for a teaching position there, which embittered him to the world of academia, and it was 20 years before he actually went back to academia, and then only because his friend, the poet Rothko, had a breakdown at Bennington College and insisted that Kunitz take that position. It's not true. In his job-seeking letters down at Princeton, he says he was offered an instructorship, and that he turned it down because he wanted a life more creative than academic. And he also applied for teaching positions in those years when he was supposedly so embittered he wasn't going to go back into academia at all. And I also have questions about the Rothko story, but I haven't dug into that quite enough yet to actually figure out what's going on. So we're all imperfect people, and you know, with a biography, you have to kind of accept that that's the case, and you have to deal with that from the beginning. But I think I've strayed on a tangent. I apologize.
No, we want you to stray. Although not from the truth, not from the truth. Is that the same position that Kunitz said he was not offered because he was Jewish?
Yes.
And I was thinking that that's sort of interesting, partly because, it seems like there is like a kind of narrative that one imagines. And, you know, I'm sure you guys have heard all sorts of cases of kind of like stolen valor, where someone somehow ends up claiming that they've had some military experience that they haven't had, and eventually they seem to believe it themselves. So it's sort of interesting to think of, you know, like a kind of sense of exclusion that surfaced in that story, even if it didn't actually happen. And I think part of the interesting question with someone like Kunitz is that he seemed to have known from the beginning what he wanted to do. You know, like in The Testing Tree, when he describes being a little boy who goes into the woods behind his mother's house with his pocket full of stones and throws them at the tree while making wishes, and one of the wishes is to be a poet. So he seems to have always like had a sense of what the shape his life would take. So now let's talk more specifically about some of your research. And so you might have already answered this question, Jim, I'm not sure, but you spent last week in the Kunitz papers. Would one say in the Kunitz papers? in the conducting research in the Kunitz archives at Princeton.
Right.
And I think there's one other person in this room, perhaps, who has been in the Kunitz papers at Princeton, who is Judy. But the rest of us have no idea like what that means, what you do, what it feels like. And so can you give us a little bit of a kind of like glimpse of what the experience was like last week? And was there like one little kind of like insight or revelation or something like that that you remember now?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of security in the archives. They check everything when you go in and when you come out. Make sure you're not running away with some first edition or something. There are 200 odd boxes of material relating to Kunitz, and they measure everything from this big to this big. I got through 20, and I was working very hard. So it's going to be a long road to hoe, but that's okay. That's the deal. I love research. And I used to love it much more than I do today. It used to be that you could go with your laptop and you'd bring out the papers, you'd look at stuff and you'd write as you were reading the papers. And it was very pleasant. It was a very pleasant kind of intellectual interaction with the past. But with the rise of the smartphone, it's not efficient. And it's not cheap to go down to Princeton for a week and just do research. So what you want to do is to get as much stuff as possible. So I use my iPhone, and I have now 1,200 images from that week that I have to go through, which I'm doing at the moment, trying to get back into reading cursive handwriting. And thank God Gail, my wife, is really good at it, because I really need that. But yeah, it's does that answer?
Yeah. So actually, Judy, you can just relax for a little while. So I'm going to ask Jim 2 other questions, and I'll ask you a few questions. So you may have remembered from my bio of Jim at the very beginning, I said first that he was a journalist, and he was a reporter at the Telegram, as was also Stanley Kunitz. And I think before going to Princeton, I don't know exactly what Jim has done. He hasn't told me like the whole structure of his research plan on the biography, but I know that he spent some time going through the archives at the Telegram, reading things that Stanley Kunitz wrote when he worked at the Telegram for his first job out of college. I think he'd worked there in the summer, and then maybe for a year after graduating. So I wonder if you could tell us like what kind of things did Kunitz write for the Telegram?
Yeah, he did a lot of stuff. He was there for, I think, a couple of summers before graduating, and then was taken on as a full-time assistant editor on the Sunday Telegram. I'm just sidetracked because yesterday I came across one of the images I took while I was down there, and it was Kunitz writing to the local paper on the Cape about misspelling his wife's name in a show that she was putting on. And he started off the letter by quoting from a sign that used to hang in the city room of the Telegram, saying, "Accuracy, accuracy, once again, accuracy." And that same sign was there when I was at the Telegram, and I checked, and it in fact is still at the Telegram, but it's been demoted to the morgue now, where they keep the old stuff. So I'm not sure that's the best place for it. But he did a lot of stuff. He had a lot of fun at the Telegram. I had first thought that leaving Harvard after that, the so-called rebuffal, he would have been in a pretty down mood. And I think he was, in the sense that he wanted to get out of Worcester. But when you read the stuff he wrote, it's obviously that he had a tremendous amount of fun being a cub reporter and going out and doing stuff. He went up to Petersham to do a story on Harvard Forest, which had just begun up there at the time. He did a wonderful story on crossing tenders. There used to be many level crossings throughout Worcester with trains going across the roads. And of course, traffic had to be stopped and then let go time and time again. And he wrote a magnificent feature on that. And the final paragraph of it is just poetry on deadline. It was really magnificent. He also had a lot of fun writing verse. He would take local news or national news stories and write poems about them. And I do have one or two if you want to hear one. Later on, maybe at the end.
No, don't, right now, don't you
Yeah.
think?
Okay. Sure.
And can you also say under what name were
Oh
these
yes, I
poems
forgot to
published?
mention that.
These
He had
bluesy
a
poems.
pen name, nom de plume, of Mathilde Eureka, or Mathilde Eureka, depending how you pronounce it. So he was, the persona was a sort of Victorian second generation Greek immigrant, middle-aged probably. And one of the things Mathilde did was to conduct imaginary interviews with writers. One of the interviews was with George Bernard Shaw in England. She got the ocean liner over, interviewed him. He made a pass at her, and then he gave her a bill for the time he spent with her. Mathilde also went up to New Hampshire to interview Theodore Dreiser. Anyone still read Dreiser? Yeah, good. And she said, she went up and she found him in the woodshed splitting infinitives. But this is one of the poems that he wrote. It was a section that it was called "It Might Be Verse," and all of his poems about news stories would go into this little category. And this one is about the annual apple harvest, the national apple harvest. It's a soft spot for me because one of my first stories as a cub reporter on the Telegram was writing about the New England apple harvest. I wasn't nearly this clever though. So he says, "Take out your pencils and your books and cultivate intelligent looks. And if you're really very brainy and not a thimble-witted zany, perhaps you will not fail to find in deep recesses of your mind the answer to this puzzling query that's worn my convolutions weary. If an apple a day keeps the doctor away, how many doctors will lose their pay when 44 billion apples appear as the size of the country's crop this year? Please solve the puzzle and ease my brain. Let not this apologue be in vain." And that was just one. There were half a dozen in there that he just banged out. So, you know, he was a master versifier. His poems scan beautifully, but naturally too. This has more of a doggerel feel to it just because of the nature of the beast. And telegram stuff. And then toward the end, in his last year, it was 1927, and that was the year when Sacco and Vanzetti were scheduled to be executed. And the newspapers were just full of stories about the defense committees trying to derail what was going on with the two Italian anarchists who were charged with murder and condemned to death. And Kunitz got very involved in this whole thing. The judge of the case, Webster Thayer, was from Worcester, lived in town on Institute Road, and actually was a Worcester Academy boy.
Was he related to Thayer?
No.
No.
But it affected Kunitz deeply, and that's one of the things he took down to New York were letters by Vanzetti, who were rather beautifully written that he was hoping to get published.
That's great. And it's like a complete shift in mood, which is appropriate to. I'm going to ask Judy some questions which are sort of more sobering as well. But this is also the point maybe where I can say later in the question and answer period, anybody who wants to could say, can we hear another one of the, it might be verse poems.
I've only got one more here.
Oh, he only has one
but
more.
It's short.
So So, Judy, I feel like one of the things that's most fascinating about your book is that most people who've read Kunitz, especially his famous poem, The Portrait, or people from Worcester who are familiar with My Mother's Pears, have this sense of Yetta as cold and austere. And so I'm wondering if you could say something about, well, was she cold and austere? But more, I guess my question is more, how did your research complicate that sense of her that comes through Kunitz's poems, and I think also even his interviews?
Well, I like to compare what we knew of Yetta just through Stanley's eyes to Matisse' line drawing portrait. Whereas after I read her words, it was more like an Annie Leibovitz photograph portrait. So you still don't know the whole person, but you can tell so much more about a character from, if you compare those two things in terms of detail and attitude and so on. Complicated, yes, because she was a complicated person. She had immigrated from Lithuania, and it was a village that she describes in incredible detail. She came to New York, and when she wrote that section, it is probably one of the best written immigrant sagas of a New York City adventure, because that's what it was. And she pulls no punches. She says how she feels about people. She was kind of standoffish. For those of you who read the book, she didn't like certain jobs where she was looking for a job because she didn't like the kind of people who were there. But she went to another factory because the people were more to her liking. So page after page, plus she was funny. When she was in Lithuania growing up, you just didn't come to America. That's where horse thieves ended up. And that's from her. I mean, she was funny. She was certainly had her opinions about being Jewish in this village and the lack of opportunity there was there. That was her reason for coming to America finally, is that, there was really nothing for her there. So to just complicate, I love Kent Lundquist's description of what Yetta ended up doing. This book complicates, it's a meaningful corrective to what we thought about her before. But don't forget, it was curated. If you write a memoir, go ahead. If you want to write a diary, go ahead and do that. But you are curating your experience as well. So are we heroes of our own legend? Sure. A diary might be a different genre to pick when you think you're just talking to yourself. But as her diary was, which was written 6 years after the memoir. So yes, I'm sorry.
No, that's a perfect segue to my next question. So when you read Judy's book, there are several aspects of it. So it's chronologically organized. It includes poems by Kunitz, or kind of references to poems by Kunitz. But it's also to some extent based on, well, I guess first this memoir, which Judy just described, and then also a diary and some letters that Yetta wrote late in her life, with the middle part of the story kind of absent, including her marriage to Solomon, Kunitz's father, who she didn't want to talk about in the house after his suicide, and which she apparently did not write about. So I've a kind of like complex question for Judy, but you can probably see where I'm going, so that there's this kind of like missing part of the story, and you also have two texts that Yetta wrote that Judy has published that no one could have read before. And again, as I think Judy kind of suggested, Kunitz himself had sort of like paraphrased and edited his mother's story himself to begin with. And so my question is, partly you have this shift from the very adventurous, independent, resourceful, hopeful, funny voice of this memoir, and then a really very sad diary that she kept late in her life, which she sounds depressed, and also some letters that she wrote to her children and grandchildren, in which she often would sort of, well, she sounds depressed in those too. So my question is partly like, how did that affect the shape of your book? Because that seems like it's not just that you're writing about someone's life, but you have these two versions of their life that are different, and the one at the end of the book is kind of a downer. And so like, how did you manage to shape that into such a good story? I guess that's my question.
Well, the structure of the book was a real challenge in that I ended up starting with the letters that were written in 1945 when she wrote the memoir, because the 4 letters that Stanley Kunitz kept out of the public collection talked about, hey, Stanley, you've asked me to write my memories of New York and Lithuania, and I'm about to do that, but who would want to read this? And so she goes on and writes this wonderful memoir, and you're right, Beth. I didn't have the diary right away, but what I found in the papers that Gretchen sent to me was a set of papers, and they're in here. Stanley was writing notes to himself, and I thought, that's not about the memoir, because he mentions the sister Sarah, he mentions euthanasia, and I'm thinking, this is different. This seems more related to the diary, to a diary, not the documents I had. So I asked Gretchen, is there something else up in the attic? Please look. And she did, and then she mailed me the next package, and that was the diary. But here you're right, Beth. You have this hopeful, she was energized in 1945. It was one of those projects that might be called an immortality project, where you think you've lived a life and it's worth sharing with somebody because you went through so many things. She was talking about her childhood and about New York City, and and she really got with it. And yet, this diary was so different. And so for the reader, for the audience, I needed to figure it out. And what happened to this woman to make her say, I'm not courageous enough to kill myself. I just hope I die. She was in pain. She felt abandoned. She had lost all sense of independence because she was in a rest home. She had a stroke. And she was really at a low, low point. But that transition, what made her like, it ended up being the longest chapter, chapter 4, and I had to break up all of the research that I had done through other letters, through Worcester history, setting the context for her life in Worcester, because she wasn't talking about it. So how did I do that? And boy, did I struggle with that. That was I wouldn't want to live through that again. It was pretty ridiculous. So I decided, probably Yetta was stepping in for me and saying, well, I ended up living with 5 different very important people. And so I thought, yeah, and I can do it and break it up chronologically. So as soon as I came to that meant first section was Solomon. But before that, I had to look into some Worcester history to put the context in what was happening in Worcester in 1893 when she came here, and what were the attitudes towards immigrants, and just do some really, and it was right in this very building that I was happy to work with Wendy S. Reed in the archives and find out some very important things about what it was like here in Worcester during that time. And I had, so building that up and putting that, and so Solomon, that was the first subchapter. And then with Sophia and Sarah, and so she ends up with her, living with her great niece. And it broke it right down and bumped her right up against having the stroke, living with her niece in 1951, and she's in Terrytown, and then gets put into a convalescent home. So that was such a gift to finally come up with that structure, because I was going mad from the whole thing. It was just really, because you do have some things like that happen.
Okay, so I'm now going to ask one last question. There are more questions to ask, but we want you guys to have a chance to ask questions as well. And so my last question will be, well, again, I want to return to the idea of writing a biography, which is also, I think, partly, like, why would anybody want to write a biography? Why would anyone want to read a biography? And I feel like if you write a biography, you must come to know your subject very well. Even though, you're dealing with someone, at least in this case, people who are not there. You're imagining them, you're kind of paying more attention to them, perhaps, than anyone they knew ever did. And you're telling this story about them. And so I'm thinking of the kind of human, social aspect of having a relationship with someone. That, and it's funny, when I first started to talk to Judy about participating in this event, at one point I sort of talked about Judy, writing about Kunitz as her biographical subject, and I said, no, I'm sorry, you're writing about Yetta. And Judy sort of talked about she was writing about Yetta, partly in terms of Kunitz. You can answer this either way, Judy, but I'm thinking that you've related to someone, like you perhaps spent many years getting to know Yetta, and again, probably better than anyone else. Same thing with Kunitz for both of you. So my question is, and you could substitute Yetta instead, or you could stick with Kunitz. So the first part of my question is, how would you sum up Kunitz's personality? Or Yetta's, if you like, because I'm assuming that you now are in the process of knowing Kunitz better than almost anyone. And another part of this question is, how has your relationship with Kunitz changed?
Is that for me then?
Either one. It's for both of you. So either one. Actually, why don't we have, because I was kind of switching back and forth, let's have Jim answer this first. Who is Kunitz? Who is Stanley Kunitz as someone who knows him and has your relationship? Is your relationship with him already changed?
Well, it's early days for me and Stanley.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're just meeting up at this point.
Yeah.
It's like a flash date.
But you're on a first name basis.
Yeah. When you do a biography, you do get to know the person you're looking at deeply. Probably knowing more about them than some of your friends and even family, in some cases. Because you've got access to diaries and journals and letters. there's always the question, though, as to, are you making the right decision about who this person is? And I do try not to pigeonhole somebody as a particular personality. First of all, because people surprise you all the time. And secondly, that can kind of put you into a bias confirmation mode where you think they're this kind of person, and so you give more emphasis to the facts that back that up. So I think you've got to be very careful about you want to get close, but you don't want to get too close. Yeah.
With Stanley, he went from being God, because a poet who could write so beautifully and engage me so completely and make me connect in poems like The Layers, which is one of my favorites. And to understanding him, some of the things were not too flattering to him, some of the letters. And I'm thinking, well, he is treating his mother rather poorly in this letter. And I remember thinking that when I came across it at Princeton, and I'm thinking, wow, he's really being mean to her, and he's not understanding her situation. So I was fluctuating back and forth from, he's so brilliant and, so accomplished and so on, to being a human being, just like we all are. He was very driven. He had an ego the size of New Jersey. I mean, he really had to believe in himself, and we have his quotes on that. He has a conversation with his mother when he's young, and he says to her, "I'm going to be a poet," and she says, "Well, Stanley, how are you going to make a living?" I kind of knew that, but how are you going to make a living? And he says, "I'll find a way." And look, he becomes one of the most powerful, influential poets, a lot from his work with the younger poets. He mentored so many fine poets, and he became quite the guy. And so we're all so complicated, right? Yeah, and he is too. Yetta, I only knew her from what he wrote about her and what he said about her in interviews. Cold, unaffectionate. I can't ever remember being kissed by her. And to me, that was a killer thing to hear about. A mother never kisses her child. But I certainly don't feel that way about her now. She's, again, a real person. She was a real person, and with foibles and prejudices and strengths and courage. And as her grandson said to me, she was so resilient. He didn't know her story, and I gave him the beginning manuscripts. He said, "I did not know she suffered so much loss." He knew her as the grandma who came and took care of him and Conrad Eisenberg when Sophia dies at the age of 30. So, that's how he remembered her. She was always dressed beautifully. Of course, she was a seamstress. But she was never going anywhere. I mean, I've heard some stuff. It's been great.
So if you want, also during the question and answer session, which will follow almost immediately, you can ask Judy what stuff she's heard. But first, let's applaud both Jim and Judy. Yay. So this is the question and answer period, but I also want you guys to feel relaxed. So if you want to get up and get something to eat and drink now, like really we're just having a conversation, not a lecture. So does anybody have a question? Right. And let's see. Here you go.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank Judy for her book.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to give you this one instead.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, she needs both. Okay.
Two-handed
Okay.
microphone. Oh, that looked a
I
bouquet.
first want to thank you for your book, because, you know, it was so fascinating to read about the life of a woman coming to this country in such detail and in her own voice. And so I want to thank you for that. And listening to you speak, I kept thinking about what it was like then and all the materials that you had to work with. And I'm thinking particularly of letters. And it sounded to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sometimes the more honest or current iteration of the person showed up in their letters. And I'm thinking, first of all, I want to know if that was your experience, that you found things out in the letters that you didn't find elsewhere, but also thinking in terms of, in this age of emails, we're losing letters. What the hell is going to happen when we're trying to put together people's lives? It's a serious concern, I think. So first, that's a two-parter, but thank you.
I suddenly realized I'm going to be getting my exercise.
So the letters were very important because it showed her in relation to these people, and she was supposed to be so solitary and so on. But where it really came out was the diary, because she used it as we do diaries, very different from a memoir where you're telling a story, you're narrating something and you're going for all the highlights and you're trying to, in a sense, entertain and tell. But a diary, you're talking to yourself frequently. And she raged at God. She talked to Stanley. She said, this is a terrible thing I'm going through. I want to say thank you everyone who was ever nice to me. And she would just go on. And she would talk about wanting to die. And she let it all out. So I think the most revelatory part of Yetta came then in the diary, and that's why it was so incredibly hard to read. And her handwriting had deteriorated because of the stroke, and she wasn't, it was difficult to read it as a document, but also she was so sad. And I didn't want to leave a word out, and I thought, as she said in her first letter, who's going to want to read this? You know? Well, I hope people do, because you see yourself reflected. We are all facing that, what she faced at some point. And she had this conversation with herself, and we were lucky enough to be able to finally read it. And you make of it what you want. And I think that's what can come of this, is that you connect with her or you don't. But she was an extraordinary person, as he was.
Okay. I'm intrigued by her educational background. What kind of I mean, it sounded like she had a very challenging first part of her life. So, but obviously she also had some intellectual grit, because she was a good writer, so I'm sure that helped Stanley in some way, even if it was just DNA. But what kind of educational background did she have to be able to be such a good writer? She just developed that skill on her own?
She was a reader. Do we
Okay,
need the mic?
maybe not.
She was a reader, and she was going to the library right up until the very end. Her library card is at Princeton as well, her overdue books. But the great treasury of great letters was one of the books in that list. Anyway, but she only went to an elementary school level.
Wow.
And it was in that day, the schools were controlled by the Tsar, the Russian schools. They got rid of all the Lithuanian teachers. But her brothers were, especially her older brother Max, was a big influence on her. And he was an intellectual, and he was questioning everything, and he had forbidden books. And she was so curious. And when she got to New York, and we cannot let this evening go by without the Educational Alliance, which still helps immigrants on the Lower East Side. She took classes. She learned how to speak English there. She listened to lectures. She pulled much of her political thought from these lectures. These were exciting times between 1890 and 1893. Zionism had grown up during the century, and it was really being a subject, just everybody was talking about it. She questioned everything. So, no, she didn't have a formal education, and she had no training as a businesswoman, but she picked up what she picked up. In 3 years in New York, she learned how to run a business. Because she was a shop girl. That's it. That's all she did. Incognito. And there's some wonderful stories in the book about that.
Can you actually, so I don't have to get up, can you pass those to Ken behind you?
Tim, did I make, is that a bad thing?
No.
Do you have any question?
Ken.
Yeah.
Let me try an idea out on you two with regard to how to approach Kunitz's life biographically. That early in his life he felt a tremendous sense of isolation. And then even in his literary career into the 1930s, he had published 2 books of poetry, and he felt frustrated because he didn't feel fully recognized, and he felt cut off from people. I think things changed a bit, and this happens gradually after World War II. He develops these friendships with Theodore Roethke and Robert Lowell, and then he's instrumental in forming the Academy of American Poets in New York and the Provincetown Arts Center on the Cape. And then he develops these friendships with a whole host of painters. He said he felt very, very comfortable. So I think as a kind of counterpoint to some of the darker aspects of his poetry, and there are plenty of them, that's for sure, there's also this sense of trying to build connections and trying to build a sense of community, if that's not too strong a word. I'd just be interested in your response to that.
Yeah, there's that great quote of his after he made his peace with Worcester, saying that, he spent he felt as if he was missing a community here when he was younger, and then when he came back, he found it was just the community that he always wanted. But that was difficult getting him to come back here, because he didn't want to. He used to avoid Worcester as much as possible. I know when the Worcester County Poetry Association was begun, it was Mike True and I think Sam Backward, the doctor, and they were trying to get 3 Worcester poets to come and read as a kind of inauguration of the society. And they wanted Olson, Bishop, and Kunitz. Olson died before they got their act together. Bishop said that she didn't really do readings, and if she did, it would cost so much it would bankrupt them. And Kunitz says he didn't want to come to Worcester, quite simply. And Mike True got the bus down to New York and banged on his door and spent the afternoon talking with him, and eventually got him to actually come back and be part of that inaugural reading. And that was really the kind of the thawing that began when he began to come back to Worcester as a community. And I may be wrong, but I think he started writing Worcester poems more after that reintroduction to the city too.
I'm really sorry to say this, but I feel like we don't have time for more questions, but I know there are more questions. But this way you can ask John and Jim and Judy individually. We have refreshments there that have not refreshed anyone yet, and Judy has books there to sell. So I ask you to applaud them once again.
Thank you.
And please, everybody who had a question, like, we still want to hear your question. So come up and ask it individually. Because otherwise, I think both Jim and Judy will think like, well, who was that other person had their hand up and what were they going to say? And let me remind you also that next week we'll be celebrating Stanley Kunitz's birthday as well, and the museum is open until 8 tonight. So there's plenty of time for you to linger and to talk and to get refreshments and to see the exhibit downstairs if you haven't seen it yet. And as I keep telling people, to take a selfie of yourself inside a poem by Stanley Kunitz. Your only chance to do this.
Thanks, Pat. That was great.